What if I told you that stupidity isn't just about being unintelligent, that it's actually something more dangerous, something that can take even the smartest people and turn them into instruments of destruction? What if the real threat to our world isn't evil people doing evil things, but ordinary folks who've just stopped thinking? Imagine this. A highly respected scientist with multiple degrees suddenly starts pushing harmful conspiracy theories. A caring teacher begins supporting toxic ideologies. A loving parent starts making decisions that put their kids at risk. These aren't bad people. They're smart, thoughtful, well-intentioned individuals who've fallen under what theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer once called the power of stupidity. And the scariest part? It's not just happening to other people. It's happening to people like you and me. This isn't just some abstract philosophical idea either. In 1961, psychologist Stanley Milgram ran a now infamous experiment at Yale. Participants, just regular people, were told by a man in a lab coat to give what they believed were electric shocks to another person. As the fake victim screamed in pain, 65% of participants kept delivering shocks, even when they thought those shocks could be fatal. These weren't sadists. They weren't mentally unwell. They were normal people who, for a short time, gave up their moral compass because an authority figure told them to. They stopped thinking for themselves. This is exactly what Bonhoeffer saw happening during the rise of the Nazis in Germany, and it led him to one of the most chilling insights about human nature ever written. But before we dig deeper into that, ask yourself, have you ever believed something, not because you thought it was true, but because everyone around you did? Hold on to that thought, because what we're about to explore might be one of the most important psychological truths of our time. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wasn't just a philosopher. He wasn't locked away in some academic tower debating obscure ideas. He was a German pastor who lived through one of the darkest chapters of human history and watched in real time as a civilized society lost its collective mind. Born in 1906, Bonhoeffer came from a brilliant family. His dad was a leading psychiatrist, and Bonhoeffer himself was deeply committed to reason, education, and ethical discourse. He genuinely believed that knowledge and rational thinking could protect society. But then the Nazis came to power, and everything he believed in was shattered. Bonhoeffer saw his friends, neighbors, colleagues, educated, moral, religious people slowly start to support horrifying policies. These weren't uneducated masses being duped by slick propaganda. These were doctors, pastors, and professors, people who, under different circumstances, would have stood against evil. Instead, they became part of it. Sitting in a prison cell in 1943, awaiting execution for his role in a plot to kill Hitler, Bonhoeffer wrote what might be his most disturbing insight. Against stupidity, we are defenseless. Not evil, not violence. Stupidity. He said you can protest evil. You can fight it. Eventually, evil trips over itself. It creates resistance. But stupidity doesn't resist correction. It doesn't even recognize it needs correction. It believes it's doing the right thing. That's what makes it so dangerous. One of Bonhoeffer's most powerful ideas is that stupidity doesn't just happen randomly. It's often a byproduct of power. See, truly malicious people usually know they're doing something wrong. There's guilt. There's friction. But people acting out of what Bonhoeffer called functional stupidity, they genuinely believe they're helping. They're doing good, which makes them almost impossible to reach with logic or reason. And that's no accident. Powerful systems, governments, corporations, institutions don't always need to suppress truth anymore. They just need to make it too hard for people to think clearly, confuse them, distract them, overwhelm them. Eventually, people stop trying to make sense of anything at all. And here's the kicker. When Bonhoeffer talked about stupidity, he wasn't insulting people's intelligence. He wasn't saying dumb people are the problem. In fact, many of the people he saw swept up in Nazi ideology were highly educated. What he was describing is more like a willful blindness, a kind of surrender of thought, a state where someone stops being an individual thinker and starts parroting slogans, sound bites, and whatever is being pushed by the group or authority figure. In his own words, and in conversation with him, One virtually feels that one is not dealing with him as a person, but with slogans, catchwords, and the like that have taken possession of him. Let that sink in. We've all seen this, maybe even experienced it ourselves. Bonhoeffer's brilliance wasn't just in naming the problem, it was in showing where it comes from. He argued that stupidity often isn't a personal failure. It's the result of systems that make independent thinking hard, even costly. Think about our world today. Social media platforms are designed to keep you outraged, not informed. News outlets get more clicks when they stir up emotion than when they offer balanced perspectives. Politicians win with slogans, not nuance. Add to that the economic pressure so many people live under, multiple jobs, endless debt, constant stress, and suddenly, who has the time or energy to carefully analyze complicated issues? Economists even have a name for this: rational ignorance. It's the idea that sometimes not knowing is actually the most efficient choice, because thinking takes time, energy, resources, and when you're just trying to survive, those things are in short supply. But here's the catch. What makes sense for one person ends up being a disaster for society. Individual rational ignorance turns into collective irrationality. That's what Bonhoeffer saw in Germany, and what we're seeing now on a global scale. And it's not just about money or stress. Our brains themselves are wired to take shortcuts, especially when we're tired, overwhelmed, or anxious. In the 1950s, psychologist Leon Festinger introduced the concept of cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort we feel when we're faced with information that contradicts what we believe. And you know what we tend to do when that happens? We reject the information, we protect our beliefs. Bonhoeffer got this decades earlier. He understood that stress and insecurity make this effect way worse. The more overwhelmed we feel, the more we cling to simple, comforting stories, even if they're not true. He also noticed something else. This stupidity shows up more in groups than in individuals. In his words, it becomes clear that stupidity is not a psychological problem, but a sociological one. When people are part of a crowd, or a movement, or even just a group chat, their ability to think critically starts to fade. Later experiments proved him right. In Solomon Asch's famous conformity studies, 75% of people went along with obviously wrong answers just because everyone else in the group did. They didn't want to stand out. They didn't want to be the odd one out. Now think about how that works today. On social media, in online communities, in real-time comment sections. Algorithms feed us what we already believe. They reward our emotional reactions. They isolate us in digital echo chambers. And when that happens, the pressure to conform gets louder, and the courage to think gets quieter. Now let's talk about social media, because this is where Bonhoeffer's warnings come into sharp focus. A 2018 study from MIT found that false information spreads 6 times faster than the truth on platforms like Twitter, now X. Why? Because lies are often emotionally satisfying. They're neat, they're dramatic, and they confirm what we already believe. In contrast, the truth is messy, nuanced. It asks you to slow down and reconsider things. When someone shares a juicy piece of misinformation that lines up with their worldview, they're not just spreading bad info, they're being rewarded for it. The platform feeds them more of the same, reinforcing that perspective and pulling them deeper into the echo chamber. Think about your feed. How often do you see things you disagree with? How often are you challenged by new perspectives? That's not accidental. That's algorithmic design. It's what Bonhoeffer might have called the architecture of stupidity. Not because people are dumb, but because they're being shaped, little by little, to stop thinking critically. And here's the most chilling part. History repeats this pattern. The Salem witch trials weren't led by evil masterminds. They were carried out by people who genuinely believed they were protecting their community. The Red Scare in the 1950s, same thing. Patriotic Americans, sincerely convinced they were defending democracy, ended up supporting censorship, blacklists, and fear-based policies. In every case, smart, educated, well-meaning people fell into groupthink. They stopped questioning. They stopped thinking. They gave in to emotional certainty over critical reflection. So if our brains are wired for shortcuts and our systems reward surrender, how do we fight back? Bonhoeffer had a term for what it takes to resist this pressure: costly grace. It means choosing to think for yourself, even when it's uncomfortable, unpopular, or downright dangerous. It's the kind of thinking that got him imprisoned, the kind that got him killed. But today, that resistance looks different. We're not just up against social pressure, we're up against billions of dollars in tech and design that exploit our mental shortcuts. Still, we can fight back. And we can start with something psychologists call intellectual humility. That's the simple idea that we might be wrong, that our knowledge is always incomplete. It doesn't mean giving up your beliefs, it means testing them. Bonhoeffer would have loved this idea. Here are a few concrete ways you can practice intellectual humility in your everyday life. 1. Create intellectual friction. Once a week, read or watch something that challenges your beliefs, not to convert you, but to sharpen your thinking. See if your ideas can hold up under pressure. 2. Embrace productive ignorance. When you feel absolutely certain about something, ask yourself, what evidence would make me change my mind? If the answer is nothing, you're not thinking, you're defending a belief. 3. Slow down before sharing. Before posting that hot take or dramatic article, pause for 60 seconds. Check the source. Ask, is this true or does it just feel good? Practice saying, I don't know. Admitting uncertainty is powerful. In a world full of overconfident wrong answers, humility is radical. But as important as individual practices are, Bonhoeffer knew personal effort wasn't enough. Systems matter too. If we want to make critical thinking easier, not harder, we have to change the environment people are thinking in. That means holding social media platforms accountable. Require them to be transparent about their algorithms, how they decide what you see, and why. We need to shine a light on how these platforms shape our beliefs and behaviors. We also need to invest in media literacy. Big time. Schools, communities, workplaces should all be teaching people how to evaluate sources, spot manipulation, and think critically in a digital world. And maybe most importantly, we need to lower the stress levels that make people vulnerable to these shortcuts in the first place. Think about it. When you're constantly stressed about money, healthcare, rent, you don't have the bandwidth to question complex political ideas or dig into long articles. You're just trying to survive. Bonhoeffer understood that. He saw how hardship made people cling to easy answers. So if we want a society that thinks critically, we need policies that give people the time and space to do it. Universal health care, job security, affordable housing. These aren't just social safety nets. They're foundations for a thinking society. Now here's where things get really eerie. Bonhoeffer saw how Nazi propaganda worked through newspapers and radio. But today, we're dealing with something way more powerful. Algorithms that know how your brain works better than you do. We're in the age of AI, of deep fakes, of systems that can literally fabricate reality and do it in a way that bypasses your logical brain and hits your emotional core. And that's not hyperbole. Neuroscience has shown that our brains evolved to prioritize speed over accuracy. When our ancestors saw a rustle in the bushes, they didn't pause to analyze. They ran. That impulse kept them alive. But now those same instincts are being hijacked. We're wired to trust what feels familiar, to cling to what confirms what we already believe, to reject discomfort. In today's world, that means we're primed to fall for emotional, simplified, familiar stories, even when they're wrong. And no one is immune. No matter how educated, how intelligent, how self-aware you think you are, if you're human, you're vulnerable. That's why Bonhoeffer's insight was so ahead of its time. He wasn't talking about IQ. He was talking about psychological and social vulnerability. He saw how fear and uncertainty turn people into believers, not of truth, but of whatever offers comfort. Here's the part Bonhoeffer couldn't have predicted, but you and I are living it every day. We're not just dealing with human manipulation anymore. We're facing machine learning systems that study your behavior down to the microsecond. What you click, what you pause on, what makes you angry, and use that data to keep you engaged, outraged, and distracted. Every reaction you have online, it's being collected, analyzed, and turned into a weapon, one designed to keep you from thinking critically. We saw this clearly during the COVID-19 pandemic. Doctors, lawyers, scientists, people with years of training and analytical ability started sharing misinformation about vaccines, treatments, conspiracies. Why? Not because they were dumb, but because they were under massive psychological pressure. Just like the rest of us. That's what makes functional stupidity so scary. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like surrender. It feels like certainty. It feels like finally having an answer when everything feels chaotic. But Bonhoeffer's life shows us what it means to resist that temptation. He was hanged in April 1945, just weeks before the fall of Nazi Germany. His final words were reportedly, "This is the end. For me, the beginning of life." He didn't die just for political reasons. He died because he refused to stop thinking. He refused to surrender his mind. And that's the core of his legacy. Bonhoeffer once asked a haunting question: who stands fast? Who stands firm when the pressure to conform becomes unbearable? When everyone around you is echoing the same talking points, when the cost of thinking differently is isolation, ridicule, or worse, who stands fast? He wasn't talking about superheroes or revolutionaries. He was talking about ordinary people who choose to keep thinking when it's easier not to. People who resist the comfort of groupthink. People who don't trade truth for popularity or peace of mind. And here's the surprising twist. This kind of resistance doesn't require a PhD. It doesn't require you to be the smartest person in the room. It requires something much rarer: discipline, curiosity, humility, courage. These aren't flashy traits, but in a world that rewards certainty over nuance and speed over thoughtfulness, they become revolutionary. Here's the tragedy Bonhoeffer understood all too well. Giving up on thinking often feels like freedom. It feels good to be sure. It feels good to belong. It feels good to not have to wrestle with uncomfortable contradictions. Thinking is hard work. It's emotionally taxing. And in tough times, certainty feels like safety. But Bonhoeffer believed that discomfort, the mental tension of questioning, of wondering if you're wrong, isn't a weakness. It's a sign that you're still human. Because when we stop thinking, we stop being fully human. We become, as Bonhoeffer put it, puppets whose strings are pulled by whatever force happens to be strongest at the moment. Here's the scariest part. The takeover of our minds doesn't come with a bang. It doesn't announce itself with flashing red lights. It happens quietly. It happens the moment we start saying things like, "I already know enough," or "I don't need to read the other side," or "everyone I follow agrees with me, so I must be right." That's how functional stupidity spreads. Not through ignorance, but through overconfidence. The moment we think we're immune, we're already infected. That's why Bonhoeffer's message is still so relevant, because it forces us to look inward, to ask ourselves, am I really thinking or just repeating? And here's the hopeful part. If functional stupidity is a choice, even partly, then that means we can choose something else. We can choose to pause, to reflect, to examine the beliefs we hold most dear and ask, why do I believe this? And is it still true? We can build systems and habits that support thinking, not just feeling, that prioritize truth, not just comfort. If we want a world where people think independently, we can't just rely on personal strength. We need to change the structures around us too. Think of critical thinking like physical fitness. You can be naturally strong, sure, but if your environment is junk food, no gym access, and constant stress, that strength fades. It takes a supportive system to help people stay mentally fit. So what do those systems look like? They look like schools that prioritize media literacy, emotional regulation, and logic, not just standardized test scores. Social media platforms that stop rewarding outrage and start rewarding reflection. News outlets that invest in nuance instead of chasing clicks. Work cultures that give people the time and space to think instead of pushing nonstop hustle. Governments that create economic stability so people aren't too stressed to care about truth. We need to design a society that makes thinking easier, not harder. Bonhoeffer may not have had the tools of modern neuroscience or AI, but he understood something that science is only now catching up to. The conditions around us deeply shape our ability to think clearly. Change the conditions, and we change the outcome. But let's bring it back to you, to right now. Thinking well is a practice, it's a muscle, and if you don't use it regularly, it weakens. So here's a simple challenge, something Bonhoeffer himself would have respected. Pick one belief you hold strongly, then spend 30 minutes looking up the best arguments against it. Not the dumbest, not the fringe takes, the smartest, most credible counterpoints. Not to torture yourself, not to make yourself doubt everything, but to practice intellectual courage. The kind of courage that says, if my belief can't survive honest scrutiny, maybe it needs to change. Best case scenario, your belief holds up and you now understand it more deeply. Worst case, you learn something new. Either way, you're building the muscle that protects you from functional stupidity. That's not weakness, that's strength. We live in a time where surrendering your mind is easier and more profitable than ever. Whole industries are built around your attention, your outrage, your emotional knee-jerk reactions. So when you choose to think carefully, you're doing something radical. You're rejecting the algorithm. You're resisting the urge to be spoon-fed answers. You're defending the idea that truth matters, even when it's messy, slow, or uncomfortable. Bonhoeffer died for that idea. You don't have to, but you do have to live for it. If this video has made you question something you once took for granted, that's not a bad thing. That's the beginning of intellectual courage. So here's what I want you to do. Share this video with someone who isn't afraid to think deeply, even when it hurts. Someone who values truth more than comfort. And then answer this in the comments. What's one belief you're willing to question this week? Not to change your mind immediately, but to test whether your belief is grounded in something real. That's how we get stronger, smarter, and more honest with ourselves. Because here's the bottom line. Every time you choose curiosity over certainty, every time you slow down instead of reacting, every time you say, I don't know, instead of pretending you do, you're not just protecting your own mind. You're defending the very idea of wisdom in an age drowning in noise. Bonhoeffer once said, the ultimate test of a moral society is the kind of world it leaves to its children. If we leave behind a world that rewards intellectual shortcuts, blind certainty, and emotional manipulation, we've failed that test. But if we can build a world where thinking is encouraged, where humility is honored, and where truth still matters, even when it's inconvenient, then maybe we'll have done something worth remembering. So think hard, question often, and when in doubt, stand fast. The world needs thinkers more than ever.